So the NLRB just made a ruling against GM. I'm sorry, a ruling in favor of GM management. And the ruling basically holds that employers should have an easier time firing or disciplining employees for, in their language, using language which is sexist or racist or otherwise abusive. In the case in point in question, this is the important piece of the story, is that this was a decision related to a case in which a black employee used what was racially insensitive language against a white manager. Something along the lines of the black employee did some sort of like caricature of shucking and jiving, and painting the manager as being a plantation owner. So this was a case of racism against a white person. To me, this speaks very broadly to the obvious consequence of the current culture and climate that we've seen coming from 100 miles away, which is that these restraints on speech that are being promulgated from folks on the left were always inevitably eventually going to be weaponized against people on the left, in this case, workers. Right? I shouldn't say people on the left, the constituencies that the left purports to care about.
What's interesting with this case is that what's been cited was that he did kind of caricatures of a slave, like, oh, you're kind of like he was being treated as a slave, was the hyperbolic statement that he was making. And so they would make the argument that this was derogatory, right? Like that the caricature of a slave should not be used so lightly, so on and so forth. It's derogatory towards African Americans, even though it was an African American person doing it, so on and so forth. So they almost like create kind of a general or globalized rule about certain types of language. And in this case, it was used against an employee or a worker who was part of kind of labor activism or, rights, wages, and conditions activism.
It actually, sorry to interrupt, but it actually says specifically in the piece that this was in the context of collective bargaining. So I imagine that it was probably at the bargaining table that this worker made this comment. So, I mean, it's one thing if on the job in the course of your regular, just daily duties, you're making some kind of a remark like that to your manager. Probably in any workplace, it would be relatively easy to fire somebody for that offense, which speaks to what, like the question, which begs the question as to why the NLRB needs to strengthen the rights of employers in this respect. But in this case, it was in some sort of bargaining context, and I'm guessing it was probably at the bargaining table, where this wasn't a worker reporting to management. This was a union member in a hostile bargaining session with management. And yet, so this is just clearly retaliation for union activity.
Yeah, I mean, there are like a few really awesome parts of this story. The Bloomberg piece about it makes note of the fact that the ruling was done by the, quote, all-male, all-Republican 3-member panel, which is like, basically you had like 3 really woke Republicans, apparently woke Republicans, handing down this ruling. And like the statement from the NLRB chairman is like, it sounds like some kind of like great civil rights speech. He says, "For too long, the board has protected employees who engage in obscene, racist, and sexually harassing speech not tolerated in almost any workplace today." Which is, just hilarious hearing that. It's just so obviously like a cynical kind of usage of what they've been handed. They've essentially been handed this powerful weapon, right, by the like really identity obsessed, like woke left. And
well, what's interesting is, so I looked up, this was a set of cases from 2019 where the NLRB started looking for public comment on changing this rule. And they cited 3 cases where they had actually ruled in favor of the employees. And they said that basically they couldn't be retaliated against for these reasons. And so this is going to have some bad language, so I'm going to try to work around it. But at one point, an employee told a supervisor that the supervisor is an F-word crook. So that was one case where the NLRB ruled in favor of the employee, said, you're allowed to do that. In another case, I think an employee wrote a Facebook post about her supervisor saying something very, very similar to that, and then at the end of it they said vote yes for the union, so that was protected. And the third case was one where I think you could argue that there was some racism employed, although even this is just a snippet of information. There were some replacement workers during a labor dispute, and one of the of the employees who was part of the labor dispute on the side of labor made some commentary about the food they eat, being fried chicken and watermelon or something. So like that one, you could probably argue was somewhat racially insensitive. But in all three cases, because these people were part of kind of labor negotiation or organizing, they were protected. So the NLRB actually ruled in their favor. But when they opened public comment that led to the series of events that led to this, they highlighted those three cases so this is actually a shift for the NLRB. They have had cases in the past where employees use either profane language or offensive or bigoted or prejudiced language as part of union organizing, but it's generally protected. So this actually is a real reversal, given their past position. Like, it's a real change. Now it seems like the NLRB is shifting to a position where if you're doing labor organizing, but you happen to use offensive language or language that can be construed that way, now it's a way to actually punish you. I mean, literally, they talk about harmonizing this with anti-discrimination law and equal opportunity law, like progressive things, right? All of which were intended to protect workers from repeated harassment or bullying or discrimination on the job, not from punishing them for an errant comment or one tantrum they had one time during a picketing line.
This sort of reminds me of a episode that I sort of saw from a distance, which was for a little while, a very short while, I was involved in a labor organizing effort for freelance journalists. And the point at which I fell out of that campaign was when, do you guys remember when there was this incident on Twitter? It was an incident in real life, but it was signal boosted on Twitter of a freelance journalist woman who lived in New York. And she had been texting with a reporter in Seattle Times, I believe, I think asking for career advice or something. And then later on that evening, the Seattle reporter texted her some sexually explicit texts, which he then later claimed were an accident. And I suppose he was married and he was meant to send it to somebody else he was presumably having an affair with or something. Regardless of whether that's true or not, that was the injury. And then this freelance journalist called for his dismissal, and he was dismissed. This was off work hours. This wasn't anything to do with anything he was doing on the job. He was fired for this, or suspended. I can't remember. I believe he was terminated. And the union that was organizing freelance journalists, apropos of nothing, like there was no demand that the union take a position on this, but somebody within the union, I think somebody on union staff, suggested that we move a petition among the membership, among the folks, the workers who were organizing, signing on in support of the freelancer in New York, signing up, essentially supporting the firing of this reporter in Seattle. And, at that point, I just dropped out of the effort altogether. And it's like, I'm not even commenting on whether it's appropriate for this guy to be fired or not for sending these sexually explicit texts to this woman. I believe on face value probably isn't, since it wasn't on work hours. But this is a union that voluntarily steps up to take a position against a worker. It's quite obvious where the momentum of this kind of thing leads to in a worker context.
That story sort of kind of like illuminates how unions, I think, take on the character of the, class of people that they're composed of, right? I mean, this is presumably a pretty professional class union, right? And I mean, I think that's, like you said, the job of a union is to prevent people from getting fired, right? Rather than getting them fired. And I mean, I think that's like a lot. I mean, that's so similar to, I think, what we're seeing with the left right now, right? I mean, we're seeing a left that is almost more into getting people fired than keeping people from being fired, Like, I mean, with that, again, with the story that you just, related, like, there is a solidarity there, but it's not like a worker solidarity. It's a professional class solidarity, right? Like, it's a solidarity with like the value set of a professional class. And
right,
I think,
and it's a perception of the threat to workers is coming from other workers, or in a non-worker context, just the threat to individuals is coming from other ordinary people, not from management, not from the state, not from actual real concentrations of power.
Yeah, I mean, this headline is the perfect Rorschach test, I think, for the left right now, right? Like, if you read the headline, you'll see, NLRB, NLRB ruling makes it easier to have sexist and racist people fired, right? And like, one type of left is going to read that and be like, oh no, that's bad that people are getting fired. I don't know if that's a big part of the left anymore, but like, some type of people who consider themselves on the left would think that. But increasingly, I think more and more of people on the left are going to read that and think, oh, that's a real victory for us.
What's interesting about this, though, I'm going through the decision. They're listing a lot of previous cases where people were protected by these. And I think in many of these cases, most average people would read them and think, okay, the person who said that in those cases, maybe they were wrong to say it, maybe it was like a bad idea, but they probably shouldn't lose their whole job over it. It's one time. Because typically the laws that people rely on are like hostile workplace laws. Like if someone's repeatedly like harassing you about your race, gender, or whatever, it doesn't really matter what. Like it's a hostile workplace, and dismissing them in that case would not be seen as very controversial. I think in many of these labor cases, it's a matter of it's kind of a charged environment. Someone's talking to their supervisor. They end up saying something sexist or racist. It's the kind of thing where people can walk away from each other and then make up. And I think that if you read through a lot of these cases, that's what it looks like. So I'll give you an example. Like one of the cases where they protected someone in the past was that there was a striker. He carried a sign aimed at a non-striker, I guess maybe a scab, asking who is Rhonda F. Sexually explicit. Fill in the blanket. Again, I'm trying to keep the show family friendly, but like, it's kind of a vulgar thing to say, no doubt about it. But it's like one time, it's in the course of kind of a heated exchange in an environment. It's the kind of thing that maybe someone would yell at you about, or you get some kind of discipline, but you can't be fired over. And they have a number of cases like this. And in some of the cases, I think people would look at it and say, yeah, it's not the ideal thing to say, but it's not really the kind of thing that's a hostile workplace if it's not repeated, if it's not harassment. And I think with this case, they've kind of set a precedent to where, the boss can keep a very close eye on you. They'll find one thing that you say. Maybe you'll say something like very, very mild, but it could be construed as offensive. Then they can bring that and they can say that actually this means that even within the context of a labor bargaining, even within context of labor collective bargaining, even within context of like labor organized campaign, it's still something that makes it an unsafe workplace. To be consistent with anti-discrimination laws, we are allowed to fire this person. And as Shant was saying, like, you have to think about the class in which a lot of this is happening. I think every case I'm reading through here is a blue-collar worker case that they've ruled in the past, right? Like, people who tend to be of that class are not as much fans of being polite and always, keeping up with the fancies of politic language and political correctness, right? Like, it's something that will probably impact them much more so than what happens in a white-collar workplace, where I think profanity and derogatory language is probably just less common because it's less common in the social class period. So it definitely does seem like something aimed at that group of people, and something that will almost exclusively, I'm sure, if a year from now, if we return to this topic and look at cases where this has come to play, I'm sure it'll always be like factory or like meatpacking plant or something like that.
It's a fucking picket line. Like, it is not uncommon on a picket line for physical violence to break out in the process of workers trying to block scab trucks from going in, etc. And the whole sort of context of setting up the NLRB to be able to regulate a strike was, back in the sort of the wave of labor unrest in the 30s. These strikes, which were massively violent, were, there was a measure of labor peace that was meant to be brought in by putting these rules and regulations around a strike. But a strike is at heart a direct action. So the idea that management gets to dictate the rules of what's said on a picket line is preposterous from the context of what a strike really is. It is not this sort of polite, managed scenario in which everybody's supposed to act like a professional. It's a work stoppage in order to force the employer to come to the bargaining table and to accede to the workers' demands. So it's just like, if this stuff goes too far in the direction of domesticating labor disputes, we might see a reversion on the part of workers. I think we've seen a little bit of this with like the wildcat strikes by teachers in West Virginia and other states, of workers just saying, fuck it, we're not going to abide by these rules. We're just going to take the direct action that's our right to take anyway. Those wildcat strikes by teachers in West Virginia and other states were illegal, but it didn't matter because it's not about the law. It's about political support, and it's about bending the employer to your will by withholding your labor power.
It seems like the category of racist has been turned into like a very catastrophized category, whereas like we think about like racial inequality, like lack of opportunity, Jim Crow laws, prison, whatever. Like we're thinking about things that really deeply impact people, that change their life opportunities, that can be life or death. But I think the idea that this has been personalized to like, if you say something that happens to be a transgression that's considered racist or sexist or homophobic, et cetera, this makes you like, this is like the worst thing in the world. You're the worst person in the world. Like there's been an elevation of that kind of thinking lately. And it's just difficult, I think, to square that with the idea that this is now like, if you happen to be in a labor organizing action and you do say something like that, maybe it was a bad idea, maybe you shouldn't have said it, but you're going to lose your whole job. They can crush your whole strike over that now. Like, I don't think that should be equated to repeated targeted bullying, harassment, the sort of things that do create an unsafe workplace, and I do think are grounds for some kind of discipline. But in terms of the cases the NLRB listed here, both in the past where they ruled in favor of the employees and in the case where they actually are changing the rule, quite frankly, I don't think it rises to that level. I think these are very like one-off events that are being used as an excuse to fire workers by companies who just don't want labor organizing at their firms.
Right. They're gotcha moments, essentially. I mean, it's basically like, it's the equivalent to like digging up a tweet from someone like 7 years ago. I mean, it's basically, and it's a wholesale like importing of like professional Twitter or online culture onto like working class people, like you said.
I just want to point out that this speaks so clearly to the real importance of this cancel culture discussion and debate that's been raging. I mean, I've seen so many takes about like, why are people obsessing over this cancel culture bullshit when, we've got a pandemic and we've got political unrest and this is a navel-gazing sideshow. But it's not, because this is where things lead. There's the whole sort of culture of appealing to the nanny state, starting on college campuses with saying we want, because I think Jonathan Haidt points this out, that the redress that's sought by folks who make these allegations is always two figures of authority, right? It's never like we need to come together and settle this ourselves. It's like the college administration needs to come in, the university administrators need to come in, and they need to fire this professor, suspend this student, take disciplinary action. And then in the professional environment, it's, HR needs to come in and crack the whip. In this case, we're seeing the fruits of that, which is a restriction of labor rights. So it's like, once the left stops fighting against this stuff and starts in some cases avidly cheering on the concentration of authority over people in these institutions, that has real ramifications for society. It's not just some navel-gazing bullshit about Twitter and elite media. It's not just a hobby horse.